Trigger warning. This podcast contains descriptions of various abusive situations. Listener discretion is advised.
In this last year, I found out that I was not the only person that this guy was doing this with.
Wow.
There were other girls in my grade that were even a little bit younger than me that he was doing this with. And he went to West Coast. He went and he's married, he has kids now, and he currently works for that same school. He
Wow.
teaches at the school that all happened. So they're fully aware of what he's done.
You are listening to the Preacher Boys Podcast, a podcast shedding light on decades of mental, physical, and sexual abuse within the independent fundamental Baptist movement. The testimonies shared on this podcast are told from the personal experience and perspective of the survivors. Not all legal outcomes are known or final. Any suspect is presumed innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. To find more information about the Preacher Boys podcast and upcoming documentary, visit preacherboysdoc.com.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Preacher Boys podcast. I'm so excited to have Ashley join me on the show today. Ashley, can you just share a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to the audience?
So when I was a little kid, I was about 7 years old. My dad took us to an independent fundamental Baptist church. We're out of the Maryland area.
Okay.
And we kind of just started going and never stopped going till later on in life. But, that's kind of how we started.
Right. Would you say that your initial experience, because you were obviously very young, so it's all you know at that point, but would you say your initial experiences felt positive at the time?
Yeah. We were in, the kids' church, we were in Sunday school. We were pretty the Sunday morning, Wednesday night kind of folks. We didn't go to Sunday night quite yet. But I would say it was overall very positive. My dad, he was a single dad at the time. And so I think he really wanted a positive outlet for my brother and I that he was solely taken care of by himself. I give him a lot of credit for that. And not that it was easy, but I think it was a way for him to keep us on the right track, so to speak, when he didn't really have that extra hand that he was used to having.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of why we started going back to, or why he went back to church and then brought us with him. So
Yeah, I think looking at it from an idealistic perspective, I think that's one of the big benefits that I am thankful for, for a majority of my upbringing was, it was excessive, the amount of things I was going to, and I wish that in retrospect, we wouldn't have been as involved as we were. But, being around the same group of people, having friends that were like siblings was that's a really cool, unique experience that I don't feel like a lot of people get. I mean, most people, they have their school friends and then they've got, their home life. And, there's pros and cons of both, but that's one thing I did enjoy as a kid. I enjoyed hanging out with other staff kids and, running around and enjoying just getting to be a kid. So how long was it until you ever felt a feeling like, hey, something isn't quite right here, or something's a little bit off with the way that we're doing things?
That's a loaded question. I feel like there were seeds of doubt. It wasn't there was something that hit me over the head while I was in it or anything like that. When I was 12, 13-ish, my dad met my stepmom through church. And actually her children, she was widowed, and her children were all in youth group together. So one of her kids is exactly my age. Another one, I was a year and a half apart. So it was kind of cool that we had these friends that all of a sudden truly did become family. Yeah. And we got very involved in church at that point because they were very involved.
Right.
But we started getting involved in the bus ministry through my stepmom. And I thought it was positive at first, overall. And then I started to get kind of some negative vibes about how the bus kids were treated in comparison to how the regular church kids were treated. It felt like there was a distinct separation on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially in light of recent events with like all of the political unrest that's happened over the summer, that kind of it kind of sparked a light bulb in me now that I'm an adult, kind of in retrospect, like, wow, that was really messed up.
Yeah.
And you know, some of the racial jokes that were made, it wasn't a very diverse area, or well, diverse at church. It is a diverse area. You know, we're right outside of Baltimore. But the church itself was not very diverse.
Right.
And my best friend, actually, growing up, and we're still, you know, thick as thieves to this day. But she's a Black woman also. And so I kind of got that unique perspective, like watching her go through a lot of it too. And like the jokes that were made to her,
right,
that just weren't acceptable, but were accepted. So
right.
that, I think that's part of it, like the big red flags and stuff like that.
Sure. Did you, when you started noticing this stuff, did you vocalize it, or was it something that it was kind of accepted at the time? It wasn't until just recently that it was kind of like this big epiphany of like, oh, that was kind of messed up.
Like, I think I would talk to my friend about it, and I would say, hey, like that, I don't know how I felt about that, but I wouldn't speak out against it.
Right.
And I'm shameful to say that, to be honest with you, but like, it was just normal. It was commonplace. You know, the adults laughed about it. You know, the adults made the jokes. My parents even made jokes, you know, to this friend, and she, you know, it's almost like a fat joke. We talked about it later in life. It's like a fat joke, you know, you laugh along or you make the joke so someone else doesn't.
Yeah.
And when she put it into that perspective, I was just like, wow.
Yeah.
And then it kind of clicked, like, wow, that, like, this was really messed up.
Yeah. Right. No, it's a tricky subject, and I just posted a clip to the Preacher Boys page of Jack Hyles making a racist joke, and you know, there were a couple people that are commenting and saying, well, like, the guy's laughing, like it's obvious they're friends or they get along, and you know, to some extent I get it, and I think that there is some layer of, when you have a really close friend, sometimes, you know, especially childhood friends, you make jokes with each other.
There are certain jokes that fly that don't fly with other people. But when you're in a position of power, that's not acceptable.
Yeah. And also too, like, you have to double check and triple check too. Like, there are moments where people, like you said, what are you going to do? You're not going to laugh. Like, you have to, you know, you're putting a person in a position where they don't want to be the person to be like, hey, that was offensive, or hey, it was this. So,
right.
You know, I was even running through stuff, and I was thinking about like high school, and I was like, man, there were so many jokes where I was like, yeah, we laughed about together, but probably shouldn't have even gone there, you know? But yeah, I'm interested. The bus route subject's an interesting one, and I do definitely recognize the distinct separation. And for us, it wasn't so much racial. It was more of the, you know, it was just a different class of person. So you had the worldly kids were the bus kids, and the Christian kids were the staff kids, basically, or the regular attendees whose parents were ushers and things like that. And, you know, it's just unfortunate, because I think it was put into our mind very early on that you need to be a light to these kids, just in general, just to these bus kids. And I get some of that. I get the, you know, there were kids that came in whose parents were doing drugs and were, you know, and they needed someone to like love on them. But it's one of the problems I see in that world in general is just loving people with an agenda of making them like you, and not just loving them for being them.
It's patronizing.
Right.
And also like to make you feel better about yourself.
Right. Yeah. And just on another level too, this is one thing that it's the reason I had an issue with some of this, even when I was in that movement, was I think there's a problem when we look at different worldviews. So we look at people coming into church who don't believe like we do. And so there's an idea of separation. I think I think it's on the parents to teach their kids how to engage with other ideas. And
Right.
so, you know, yeah, you can teach your kid, if you're a Christian and you're raising your kid as a Christian in a Christian home, I think that's fine. I think that's okay. But I also think when you get to a point where you say, I don't want you to encounter anybody who's different because it
Right.
might shatter your faith, you have to address the truth of one of two things. One, your faith's not very strong if it can't engage with any other worldview. Or two, like you're just not well equipped enough to engage with this kind of stuff, and you're putting yourself on a pedestal above other
Mm-hmm.
people around you. So yeah, I'm always fascinated by that, and I know that the race thing does play in very heavily to a lot of us. I mean, I mentioned First Baptist of Hammond, like there were a lot of people who referenced pretty heavy, divisive sections there. So,
I
but
will say that it wasn't like it was subliminal. Like Hyles Anderson and like some of the other like camps, so to speak, that you guys talk about that are very very, very strict and very, very damaging. I would say that my church was on the milder end of things, but that doesn't make it any less damaging. And
right,
I think that's kind of where I'm at right now, and realizing like, oh, so this is equally valid. It needs to get talked about.
right.
So
Right. So you're mentioning where you're at right now. I'm curious, where are you at right now, and we can kind of work backward from there.
okay. I'm kind of in the process of figuring out what I believe and why.
Hmm.
I'm to the point I've gone so far as to question, is God good? Is the Bible actually correct? What is the right way? A couple of years ago, maybe a year or two, yeah, probably about 2 years ago, I got kind of sucked into, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, the World Society Mission Church of God. That's also considered another cult.
Mm-hmm.
By some folks. They believe that like there's been there's the second coming has already happened. But I
Okay.
started to see a lot of similarities in like your way or the highway kind of feeling,
Hmm.
and everybody is there all the time and everybody does the same exact thing. And then I started actually watching the Leah Remini Scientology
Right.
stuff on Hulu, and I'm like, wait a minute, this all sounds way too similar.
Right.
What's
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah.
And kind of picking that apart, that's really where I'm at.
Yeah.
So
So what was that got you to this point? So kind of like rewinding a little bit into your life,
sorry.
and no, that's fine. I wanted to jump ahead and see where you are so we can kind of like draw the
Mhm.
lines here. And I'm curious, like, what was you mentioned some things that were a little bit off to you, but what was the things that really started turning your wheels and saying like, you know, maybe we don't have all the answers. Maybe this isn't correct. Or, I don't know, maybe something that was so egregiously wrong that you were like, okay, something's off here.
I was pretty bought in. I was
Oh,
pretty bought in from like I would say from like my childhood years. I just kind of followed along because that's what we did. We went to church. It
right.
really wasn't a big deal. It wasn't very deep. Um, and then as I got to be a teenager, like 13, 14, 15 years old, like I said, I started getting involved with the bus ministry. And into high school, I ended up going to the Christian school there as well.
Okay.
So church was pretty much our whole life. Um, and the Christian school was comprised of not just church members' kids, but other churches in the area sent their kids there. Even some non-denominational kids kind of got in there, but they were kind of like looked at a little bit differently.
Right.
I remember in youth group they would talk about the skater crowd church across the city. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Across the road or whatever. And just like the judgment and the focus on standards. We weren't like culottes quite there, but
Mm,
girls had to wear really baggy basketball shorts if they were going to
right.
wear anything other than a skirt. And um the idea of just doing more and doing more and doing more. You know, you're going Sunday and Wednesday. Why aren't you going Sunday night?
No.
Why aren't you going soul winning on Wednesday before or after school before youth group? You know, and then just adding on and adding on. And it was an immense amount of pressure. I was starting to feel like really depressed, like severely depressed around that time. Like 14 years old, 15 years old, really just having a tough time and not really having a word to put to it because I didn't understand depression. It wasn't something that was ever talked about. I didn't understand anxiety. You know, I didn't have a word to put to it. And so in that, one thing led to another. I was a freshman in high school, I believe, at this time. And I was approached by one of the older boys that was in my stepbrother's grade. He was a senior and I was a freshman. And one thing led to another. Keep in mind, I was 14 and he was 18. And pictures got exchanged that would be considered child pornography to in my adult mind now. And I felt so guilty, but I continued because I felt so sad and I felt very alone at this time in my life. My mom's like completely out of my life. And so I just felt like the odd man out a lot. Just because everybody's lives were together and our family was kind of the one that was the odd man out, so to speak. And so just kind of felt sad. I don't know what, 14, 15-year-old thoughts, being sad, whatever. And so I went to a youth conference. We did all the youth events and the youth conferences, and every event I was there. It wasn't like it was, hey, if you got the money to go or whatever, let's do this. It was kind of expected that you went no matter what. And so we went to like a mini youth conference. It was like probably a one-night deal. And I sat through one of those sermons where they passed around a flower and made you feel like crap about yourself. And for anybody that's not like familiar with that, they basically pass around a flower, and like by the time it's passed through all of the rows, the flower looks all beat up and stuff, basically saying like your purity is that way. And I don't know if in your church they were like this, but they really pushed accountability. And like accountability partners, and like, you can pray with your friend, and, you need to keep yourself accountable, and iron sharpens iron, and all of that stuff. So, I eventually actually felt so guilty. Like felt sick to my stomach, and I confided in somebody, about what had happened. 'Cause I just felt so lousy about like the circumstances. I thought like I did the worst egregious thing in the world. You know what I mean? When in all reality, like, yeah, probably not a smart decision, probably not the best thing to do, but like your life will move on. But it felt like the end of the world at the time because of how much pressure and what I just sat through listening to. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, that fits in with what you're saying. I mean, it's that culture of, pressure. You're constantly under pressure, and that's how I felt. And it's funny looking back, and I look at my teen years, and I look back at, I did do stupid stuff 100%, like every teenager. I always tell my wife, I'm like, I feel like especially teenage guys should be like, locked in a cage for like, 13 to 18 until they become like human beings. It's like, it's, not literally. I hope nobody pulls that quite out of context, but no, I just told her, I said, yeah, your brain's not wired all the way. You're not you're not developed, you're trying to figure this out. And then when you add into that, the factors of you're in a super restrictive kind of community, so you can't talk about weird things that you're feeling and experiencing. And then there's all this pressure. So, I look back at my teen years, I used to beat myself up so badly about anything that I did wrong or any mistake that I made. And the reason I did is because that was better than getting beat up by a youth pastor or by, fill in the blank with whoever else, because when you went forward, it wasn't let's counsel you through it. More often than not, it was you failed, start at ground zero and work your way back up to the level you were on. And that's going to take as long as it takes. And that's really discouraging, especially when your identity as a 15 or 16-year-old, or in your case, a 14-year-old, is when your identity is the church. So to lose that status is everything.
I will say, to give a good timeline, this relationship continued from like probably ages like 14 to 15. So I was a freshman in high school. He was a senior. He went away to West Coast Baptist College. So I was in my sophomore year, and eventually I was actually expelled over this because the person that I confided in decided to tell his sister. And it got spread around like wildfire. And I wasn't really familiar. I don't know if you experienced this, but there was a fair amount of gossip, but I didn't think that there was normal levels of gossip, I guess is the right way to say it, teenage type stuff. But I didn't think me feeling the way I felt, and I don't even know what the word is, lamenting. It was very serious, like how what's the word? Like very repentant. I felt very like very wrong for what I did and didn't intend to make that same mistake, but I wanted to have that accountability. And so for it to get spread around eventually, it was just, I felt like I had an A on my chest.
Yeah.
And it eventually got around to the administration.
Right.
And I was pulled in on a Wednesday night before youth group, and I was sat down by my principal with my dad and my stepmom, and they expelled me.
Wow.
And
interesting. So you were at what age? You were like 15 here?
I was 15. Sophomore year of high school.
And I already know the answer to the question because you didn't say this happened, but I'm assuming that nobody ever like reported this or like actually dealt with it.
No. They like to calm me down in a sense. Like I was very, I thought I might get demerits. I thought that I might have gotten, I knew it was coming in a sense. Once I found out that more than just that one person knew. Once I had that appointment set, I knew that something bad was going to happen, but I didn't anticipate to get expelled over something like that. They said that I could maybe come back in a year. It was like a slap on the wrist. They said that had it not gotten spread around, basically that it was my fault. And yeah, I did confide in somebody, but that was the culture that was pushed.
What do you mean when they said if it hadn't been spread around? Are you saying that they would have been a lesser punishment if it had just been dealt with just you?
Yeah, like they were going to push it under the rug had no one found out about it. But because people found out about it, they now had to expel me.
Basically. They couldn't have you saying there's an example of someone who got away with it, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But I'm sure the guys got away with whatever all the time. So.
Sure. Do you, I know obviously you don't have to give a name or anything, but do you know if the guy that was involved, is he still doing like ministry stuff? Do you know anything about that stuff or?
So that's kind of why I decided to come forward. So fast forward, I'm in therapy, this past year. And I know now, in this last year, I found out that I was not the only person that this guy was doing this with.
Wow.
There were other girls in my grade that were even a little bit younger than me that he was doing this with. And he went to West Coast. He went and he's married. He has kids now, and he currently works for that same school. He teaches at the school that all happened. So they're fully aware of what he's done. And I honestly don't even know how I feel about him, because I almost feel as though he's a product of his environment as well. I have very mixed feelings about, like, it was wrong, but I think the environment created that in him. You
How
know what I
so?
mean? Like his parents, his dad was a deacon for the church. And his grandfather was a senior pastor at the church. And they were very, very strict. And a lot of the things that this person would talk to me about as far as things that were going on at home were very extreme, in my opinion. Like I was friends with his older brother too, and his dad had him cut grass with scissors at one point as a punishment. Just like very extreme legalistic type people, and in that environment, and just I don't know. I've tried to look at it both ways, like through that lens of, well, had I not been kind of pulled out of it when I was, or when I cleared or whatever, like my brain cleared, so to speak, like I might have turned out way worse too.
No,
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I understand that it is difficult. And it's, it all goes back to, I mean, many things can be true, there's, I think that yes, our environment can shape us, but then also too, we have to make choices,
take accountability.
So it's, yeah, many things can be true. It's a hard thing to think about. And, I mean, obviously with, I think the balance there is, we have to, you can't negate the responsibility, I guess, that there's that personal responsibility. And so, that was one thing, you haven't got to these episodes yet, but, talking about people like Jack Scott and, people, I'm just looking through a bunch of stuff now, and so many people were defending him, saying, oh, he was under so much pressure. He was under financial pressure and this and that. And it's like, well, the economy doesn't, a bad economy doesn't make you, a rapist. Like it doesn't,
right. That's very true.
It doesn't do that. Can a culture where you're, I think the IFB is a very sexualized culture. And I think
Agreed.
that it's very restricted. And I think that it does lead to these implosions. But again, the person who implodes is responsible for their implosion. So it's kind of a mixed thing, but I definitely understand what you're saying. And it is scary to think about. And I think it falls, for me, I think where it falls in line more is, the people who do cover up for these things and who do truly believe, and they're dead wrong, but who truly believe that covering things up is good because it's going to protect the ministry or the cause, or, any of the buzzwords that they throw out. And, I look at that, I'm like, man, I could have easily been one of those people. I could have easily bought into that. And so it's just tricky when you get into the idea of like brainwashing and, group think, and, when you believe it's us versus the world, and this is going to make us lose A, B, or C, it's tricky. But, yeah, I guess I'm curious, when you talk to the other people who had similar experiences, what are their kind of thoughts on it? Is it something where they are like, in retrospect, how did nothing happen? How did this not become a bigger deal than it was?
So I've spoken to other folks. Actually, you do have an interview scheduled with one other gal that went to the school there. But I have not spoken to the same, the victim that was dealt with my abuser, so to speak, or the person that happened with. I don't even know where to categorize him. Again, I'm still kind of pulling everything apart.
And this is just for people listening, like we had talked beforehand, like this is pretty recent that you've talked about any of this. So there's a lot of processing that's going on, and a lot of thinking through the situation.
Absolutely. I had a good friend that came over this past summer that I knew from this time in my life. And her mom was on staff there.
Okay.
And so she kind of had some inside knowledge about what was going on. And that's how I was informed about this other person that also had things happen to them. And I guess the staff member pulled her youngest daughter out because she's like, I'm not having this guy teach my daughter. He's a pedophile. Why are you having him teach here?
Right.
So that's kind of how I was made aware. I haven't made contact with her. I tried, but she did not respond to a message. So I was just kind of, trying to see what she had to say, if anything, but didn't really go anywhere, which is understandable. I know it's tough to talk about.
Right. So I guess my question for you would be, what are you hoping for in the next, looking into the next couple of years? And now you're kind of, obviously in this process, you're trying to think through like belief systems, you're trying to think through process, like experiences that you used to kind of put under this umbrella of like, oh, it was, normalizing things that shouldn't have been normalized. What's kind of your goal over the next, couple months and years, like as you're trying to kind of move forward and grow and kind of process all of this?
I'm just looking for truth, whatever that truth is.
Yeah.
Over like the past few months, as far as like COVID was concerned and all like the political stuff that's been going on and everything that's like been causing generalized anxiety with the greater American population.
Yeah.
I've kind of examined a lot in my life. I got very, very concerned about the end of the world. That's like a deep-seated fear that I've had, like even as far back as when Trump started that stuff with North Korea, and them going back and forth on Twitter. Like every time I saw one of those little like they're like pesticide things in the sky, I'd freak out. It's a nuke, because that's the level of like truly terrified that I was, because I didn't really have all of my beliefs settled in my brain. Yeah. And they put such an emphasis on, well, beyond a shadow of a doubt, do you know that you're going to heaven? I don't know if you've ever heard that terminology. Like, are you for sure beyond a shadow of a doubt? That's a lot of pressure for a kid or a teenager. Right. Like, and I don't know taught
that like it could be any second could be too late to figure it out, and any second could be the beginning of this horrific end times event. And again, I think it's when that's used so much to motivate you to take action. Like you can't think clearly because you're just in a panic trying to do something to make sure that you're set for whenever it does go down.
Right. Did I mean that prayer enough? How many, ABC, please come into my heart prayers did you say,
Right. Did you mean it enough? Did you say it fervently enough? And I guess no, I think that's really interesting. It's interesting. Obviously talking to you so freshly, thinking about this stuff, but I guess my question would be, was your experience in the IFB limited to this specific church, or did you end up like pursuing any other churches, going to Bible college? Did your journey kind of end once you graduated?
So when I was kicked out of school, I continued to go to the church for a little bit.
Okay.
And as, time went on, I got a job outside of, the regular, church group of people. I did have experience. My brothers did go to West Coast, Baptist College. Okay. So, there was a lot of that around, so to speak, my family, but I never went to Bible college. I intended to, but after all of that, I just kind of fell away from it and didn't really know where I stood, and kind of put it on a shelf somewhere and just didn't want to touch it because I didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
It was like I was afraid to move away from this place, this IFB place, because I thought that was the only way to be. That's the only correct way. We only have that truth, and trying to read the King James Version Bible by myself, forget that. How am I supposed to figure that out? And then I didn't want to follow somebody else's teachings because I was already questioning. So it's like, how do I study the Bible? Where do I even start? And what's truth? Right. And so that's kind of where I left it. And only now, like I'm 24 now. So in like my early 20s now, that's when I really started to think about, well, what is the meaning of this,
Mm-hmm.
and what do you really believe, and why do you believe that? Is there a good reason that you believe that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that was a big stage I went through when leaving kind of the IFB world was, I found myself in a position where like, is this legit? Is there any part of this? And, it really kind of kicked off just 2-year kind of just study session. And, I say 2 years, but 2 years intense study session of just, what do I actually believe, and
right.
I just always said, like, I was just kicking at the floorboards. Like, I've built this house. I grew up built up in this house, and it's like, I'm going to kick out all the floorboards, and whichever ones stay put, I'll keep, and whatever
Right.
ones just smash through. And, it was a lot. It was studying, where does the Bible come from? Where does this come
Right.
from? What, all these things that you take for granted. Is the King James Bible specifically different, and, that I'm nowhere near the end of my, journey, because I'm 25.
Right.
So I'm a year older. And I think you spend your whole life narrowing down what exactly is truth. But I know for me, it was, I'm just glad I did it. And that's where I struggle. And I've said on the show, like, I'm a Christian, like I still in many ways am Orthodox Christian, believe many of the same
Right.
beliefs, think they're way off in a lot of ways. But one thing that I just never wanted to do on the show is like tell people like, oh, you need to, just push through, force yourself to think one way or another. Because at the end of the day, I think one of the big reasons that there was this identity crisis leaving the movement is because you're forced to just suck it up and act as if you believe, even if you're struggling with it. And
yeah, there's no questioning it.
Yeah,
there's no, well, why do we do this? Well,
right.
and then if you ask why, it's always, they tell you, at my church anyway, they did tell you an answer, but it was always very abrasive. Like, like, why are you questioning this?
Right. Yeah.
And particularly the kids, I would say that our camp, we were 50-50 West Coast and Pensacola Christian College. Okay. There were a few people that might have gone to Bob Jones.
Yeah.
So it was all kind of pretty well divided, but we were never quite as crazy as Hiles, so to speak. And when these kids would come back from college and, they're helping out in the youth group or whatever, and we ask a question, well, blah, 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 and just like start like spewing Bible at you. And it's like, bro, it's just asking you a question.
Right. But that goes back to, the Bible college students are taught the same thing. They're not taught to engage. They're taught to, defend. Like that's
regurgitate.
Yeah. Regurgitate and defend and just state your position louder than the other person. And, again, I think at that point, even taking it from a theological perspective and taking it from a perspective of actually wanting people to believe in a certain set of doctrines, if someone's doing it and they don't believe it, it's of no more benefit to anything. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's no, and that's just where I really struggle with conversations. This is totally just like a rabbit trail from like what I normally talk about on here, but I'm glad you're bringing this stuff up. But it's like, that's when Christians get into the conversations of, well, I don't necessarily agree with what, so-and-so does or this does.
Right.
And, I understand it, but I think sometimes we get so caught up in that, like, do I agree with what they're doing? And I guess where I sit is like, I think you can have the discussions if someone's open to it. I think you can talk about it, but ultimately, like, I don't want someone to go through the motions of living out what I agree with just because it'll make me comfortable. Like, I want someone to do follow in accordance with what they believe in. And I hope that, the Christian side of me and someone who actually does get excited about this stuff is like, I hope that they'll, ask or have a conversation and also have that conversation knowing like my ultimate goal is not to just sit there and, have a conversation with you just because, I want to convert you. You know what I mean? Like,
you have actual motivations. Like, I'm interested in this human being.
I care about you.
I want to have this conversation.
Right. Like, I care about, did you get that raise? I care about, are you healthy? Are you, and, even this conversation, like you saying like, oh, I'm working through, I'm questioning. A few years ago, I would have been like, well, do you want to make sure today, and walk you through that same prayer you already know you've prayed 20, 30 times. And so I think what you're hearing is so important. But again, it all keeps going back to pressure. It's can we discuss, can we grow, can we learn, can we circle closer to truth without force feeding somebody what we believe.
Yeah, I think that level of that pressure that we just keep talking about, it created a level of anxiety in me that like it is translated into a lot of other places in my life. And I think the not questioning and just kind of accepting things for what they are has kind of opened harmful doors in my life, so to speak, kind of like opening the door to other forms of abuse. As far as like I was in a relationship for 3 years that was not healthy in any way, shape, or form. And I ended up getting a restraining order and all of that kind of stuff. And I hear this reoccurring theme on the podcast that, these people, particularly women, but I know men can be abused too. They get away from this cult, and then they get or whatever you want to consider it. And then they get towards something else that's completely dogmatic and unhealthy as well, because that's all they're used to. You don't know what a healthy relationship looks like. There is no sex ed in these schools, and abstinence is the only thing that's preached. And I understand that ideal is fantastic and wonderful, but you also need to know what something healthy and unhealthy looks like, because otherwise, how are you going to know to say something? So I just think you're kind of setting yourself up for failure and opening the door and creating a hotbed for bacteria of the IFB people that to just get gross, so to speak. I don't know. That's the best way to say it for me. I don't know.
Well, speaking of healthy and unhealthy, I usually wrap up every episode with this question. And I mean, obviously we've talked a bit about the, pressure, the cultural pressure, the, a little bit of cover up and things like that, and just trying to ignore certain issues. I guess my question would be, when it comes to the IFB, do you think that there is a way for that movement to kind of redeem itself, to change for the better? Or do you think it's something where, the way that it's structured just doesn't lend itself to that kind of change or to any kind of positive direction shift?
I don't like to speak in absolutes, because I know that there are a lot of really good people. Actually, I called my one of my siblings before I did this podcast in the event that it got back to him, just because he's very IFB. He just graduated from West Coast, and he has very pure intentions. I know my brother. And, I know that there are very pure and good-hearted folks that helped me along the way, in certain times of need and things like that. But I think that, and not to get political, but in the same concept that, like, not necessarily all cops are bad, but the system itself breeds a certain result. I think that that's very similar with the IFB. Whether or not you believe that, ideology about cops, that's what I'm kind of saying with the IFB, and that there are good people, but the system itself just kind of makes it very difficult for very good results to happen. And the silence, and being afraid to speak out about certain things, and when you aren't able to question things, that means that there's a lack of communication and dialogue with your superiors, with your youth leaders, with your parents, depending on what family you're from. And so all of that together kind of encourages silence among victims, particularly young ones, and the fear of it being out there and your business being out there, or, you being slut shamed, or I'm going to ruin so-and-so's ministry, or whatever the reason is. I just think that it encourages that bad behavior.
Right.
So I would say probably not. No. I think that there was a guy on here that gosh, I think he was your friend from Louisville.
Oh, Joe Tyndall. Yeah, we did the episode about racism where we got into that a little bit with.
Or maybe I'm thinking of the wrong episode, but this guy said that, you know, he goes to a church. They're not IFB. They have some similarities. You know, they use the King James Version because they're comfortable.
John Hollifield.
Yeah, it might have been the episode before that. I listened to that very recently. And I think that if people from the independent fundamental Baptist movement, if folks that saw a flaw in that did something more along those lines, I think that could work.
Right.
But I don't think that you can still be labeled IFB. No. And I will say that that the church that I was at got progressively worse. I don't know if you know of Lou Rossi. He was
I'm familiar with him, but I'm not super overly familiar.
He was very radical, very much like the nationalism kind of patriotism, worship America kind of guy. He ended up becoming pastor at the church that I went to towards the end of things. And so it just got progressively more radical. I don't think that the pastor that I grew up with, I think actually he's a very good person. He was well-intentioned. I think like his family, they're good people. I just think that they were in a bad movement and kind of forced to follow certain rules.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of good people in that movement. There's people that get upset with me who, you know, just, I mean, are rightfully so very upset, but I think there are good people, you know, and I think everybody I've had on the show is a good person who ended up leaving because it wasn't a good experience. And so, I think what you said though is so perfect. It's a good illustration. There might be some good people, but they're working in their existence is in spite of a system that would give them open opportunity to be something horrible.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I love that perspective. And I appreciate you sharing and just taking time. I know that you're getting through the show, you're listening to it for the first time, and I appreciate you taking the step to reach out and talk a little bit. And I hope this episode's going to help some people.
Me too. I mean, I honestly, had I not stumbled upon the podcast, it's kind of like one of those deals where I saw somebody comment that I was friends with on the Preacher Boys podcast. And I was like, oh, what is this? And it was an article about David Gibbs. And I was like, wait a minute, I know who David Gibbs is. He spoke at our church before.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, I know what the Christian Law Association is. And so I started like pulling that apart, and man, I'm so glad that I don't feel alone anymore in this.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's bittersweet seeing how many people resonate with these stories. And I'm glad you found the show, and I'm really excited to stay in touch. And I'm really thankful that you reached out. That's a big step. And can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Preacher Boys podcast. If you appreciated the content on the show, please leave a review on iTunes, and don't forget to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter with the handle @PreacherBoysDoc.